3 country dances and 1 to be a bit conceited arena. Sing after cellos as yours feels or a time that seldom is seen. Sing after fellows as yours therefore a time that seldom is seen.
We're sitting here in Hazelworth, Bruton in Somerset in the UK. In Threshing Barn, where you've just installed a new work here, and led me to think about the nature of site specificity in your work and place. When we think of a site-specific public artwork, I think people often think perhaps artists arrive sort of with nothing and all their ideas come from the place, but of course that's not how you work at all, and there are all sorts of associations that you carry with you from place to place. But I was wondering if you could talk perhaps about the importance of place and when you arrive at a particular site, how do you begin?
Yeah, well, for instance, when I went to Kassel for the first time to do the initial site visit for Documenta, I went to the train station I didn't know anything about its history other than it had formerly been the main station. But it was the atmosphere of it that really kind of struck me, and how quiet it was. But it was only really when I went to the platform's end that I started thinking about these themes of distance and separation, which are recurring themes in my work. You know, the idea that the sound could come from afar towards the listener from the end of the platform. And so then I did the research into the place and discovered that it had been a place where they had made these deportations of the Jews to Theresienstadt. And I was familiar with Theresienstadt through reading about it in Sibolt's book Austerlitz and the Czech composer Pavel Haas. And I worked with one of his compositions, Study for Strings, that he composed while he was in Theresienstadt. I'm looking for different things. It could be the architecture, the acoustics, the atmosphere, the history of a place.
But you're very careful, aren't you? I'm aware of in your work of not indulging in the nostalgia of a place. There's something that happens in your work which is the separation or sense of loss. For example, in this new work here in the Threshing Barn, it's a very bucolic setting. We're surrounded by Somerset Hills. When you're thinking through making of a new work in response to place such as that, how do you prevent yourself falling into sort of giving a place or a landscape a soundtrack? What is it that's happening where there's a tension there?
I'd come across some really amazing material when doing the research for Surround Me, the song cycle for the City of London. And I was looking at Ravenscroft's city rounds, but I also knew that he'd compiled a lot of songs for the country, and so I went back to look at those, and especially John Playford's The English Dancing Master, which is where I first encountered Wood So Wild. And there's this amazing sort of illustration of a barn in front of it, which reminds me of this barn. And so I really liked this little guide to the, of how to dance these country dances. I mean, they're really beautifully illustrated, and they show, and it's about the sort of spatial patterns over intricate footwork that you might have done at court, you know. So, and I sort of wanted to do that with the work, you know. So I have work here and in the interconnecting space of the courtyard and the cloisters. The work that I made for London, it had this theme of water and tears, and it was more melancholy. But you know, these dances, of course, they're dances. They're not melancholy, but there is a kind of darker side with this theme of exile and banishment. And
there's an interesting process that happens as a listener in your work, I think, which is a sort of slowing down. And I wonder if you're very conscious of that in your process of making. I'm thinking particularly of Study for Strings and Kassel, but even here in Somerset, there's something about time which is very interesting, that it both it makes you slow down and pause and think about perhaps historical sounds that are being brought back into the contemporary moment. your works aren't, there isn't a great deal of sort of speed or rush or cacophony in them, that there is a sort of moment of contemplation or slowing down in them that I think is very interesting. Are you very conscious of that in your process of development?
I mean, there's two ways to experience my work in public space. I think people either just happen upon it and they're surprised and they become very aware of their sense of self in that particular place, that particular moment, or you're waiting in anticipation, and I think you become very aware of the time passing. And when I record the sound, I often work with the ambient sound in between the recordings, and they become, so even when you don't hear the voice, you might hear, or the musician, you might hear his breath, or you know, so the physicality of the presence, my presence or their presence are always there.
I often think about your work as a process of allowing us to tune in to a moment or being present in a place. And I know that you've used that term in regards to tuning into ambient sound. Obviously here in a rarefied space of a gallery space in a former threshing barn, we can control the sound to a certain degree. But what about when you're working with public space? How do you deal with those ambient sounds, and how important is that to you in the process of making the work?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, sometimes the ambient sounds can be really strong, like under the bridges of Glasgow where I showed Lowlands. I mean, the sounds there could be incredibly intense. You know, you have the sound of the train, you have the water, the traffic, the people, cyclists passing, you know, so, and then the sound interjects over those ambient sounds. And I think there is a process of kind of tuning into it, because when you just listen to those ambient sounds, it can be a cacophony of sound, but people happen upon it unexpectedly, or they're waiting in anticipation. They become very aware of the place, their senses become heightened, they notice the architecture, something happens, you know, when they hear the sound, you know. And I think, you know, like Lowlands, where I'm singing this old Scottish ballad, three different versions of the same ballad, playing under the three bridges, you might kind of walk under those bridges every day, but you might not be that aware of the architecture. But I think what the sound does is really make you see it in a new way, you know.
So as part of your process of making, the understanding of architectural space and environment is just as important as the production of the sound, and how those two go together?
Yeah, that's a big part of it, you know, how your sense of self becomes heightened while being aware of the environment. And I think as well, especially these urban sites that I've chosen, like the bridges over the Clyde, I mean, they're very gritty and urban, and yeah, it is this ballad, a very sad ballad about, you know, a drowned sailor, but you know, the environment stops you from being completely entering into this state of reverie with the work, because you know, you are battling with these other street sounds, and so you're having a kind of simultaneous experience of being taken away but also very grounded in the present moment.
There's the desire in the commissioning of public artworks for permanence, and I wondered how you felt about that in regards to often your works being temporary or transitory. You have of course made permanent works, but what's your feeling around the legacy or lifetime of an artwork?
Well, that brings to mind this thing I'd read that Marconi had once said that really resonated with me. You know, like when sounds are generated, they never actually die away completely, and that they're still out there, reverberating around the universe, you know. And I just thought that was such an evocative notion, you know, that all the sounds that we ever make would still be out there, however faintly, you know. And so I suppose any sound installation I've done is is permanent in a sense.
And his was jacket on the green jacket, to white goes round in between. And his was jacket on the green